Dagnabbit. Open broadcast. So hello. So you've just missed about 25, however many minutes that was. No, it's open broadcasting software. The bleep 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 application keeps swapping around the audio and mic settings. So you hear the. So you've basically been listening to music for the past 5 minutes, which will probably get the stream pulled. That is so annoying. Yeah, it's all your fault, Polly. Distracting me, that's what it is. Yeah, so Open Broadcast keeps switching round. If you have desktop audio and microphone as separate devices, or if you have a separate microphone as a... I think this is a USB or an external device, it gives you a channel for the mic and a channel for the desktop audio. And it keeps swapping them around. So in the previous stream yesterday, the mic was at the bottom of the two options that are available, but today it's at the top. So if it's constantly, well, if you go through a series of sessions where the mic switch is at the bottom, you just automatically assume it's at the bottom and just click the X, because obviously getting all the stuff sorted out for the streams. And then of course it turns out that that's not actually the one that should have clicked, because it swapped them around and put the mic at the top. Yeah, so hello. That is so annoying when it does that, so I have to start all that again. So where were we? Where was I? Dagnabbit. That is so annoying when it does that. Oh, I drew some squares. Yes, so yesterday, right, that's right. Okay, so yesterday, what we did was that to create the effect of these hearts being pooped out the back of the bike. That's not funny, Liana. Not funny at all. So yesterday, well, that's what I was talking about. The node skeleton. Right, so morphs. One of the problems with morphs is that they are very simple to set up, but their use becomes complicated depending on the overall project's setup. So with nodes are dead easy to use for furniture and rooms and one or two other pieces of IMVU stuff. But the problem with them is that so everything is routed to the root node of the furniture item. But the way that the FBX works, it creates a hierarchy from objects that are all linked together. But each one of these is still seen as a separate object. And it's just a sort of a numerical reference between each of the objects that rebuilds the structure so that we then have an actual hierarchical skeleton. But the problem with that is, hey, drawing all over the screen. The problem with that is, come time to do your morphs, these hearts are all separate objects, and they've all got their own root node, because when using nodes, because nodes work in a different way in Blender than they do in Max, so we can't treat these nodes as though they were bones and link them together in the same way, because all we're essentially doing is linking a set of root or core objects. Each one of these is an object in its own right, so they're all independent elements or items. But within FBX, that basically means that when you export something that's got complex animation going on, so there's each one of these is animated, the bike itself is animated, so we've got essentially 4 groups of objects that are all linked to the root object. And for a straightforward animation, that's fine. You end up with essentially 4 meshes. Yeah, 4 meshes inside IMVU. Come on, IMVU. Where's IMVU gone? There we go. Not in that version. Need to go back to an earlier 13. Let's try that one. Right, so here we go. So if you use nodes for complex items, what we end up with is a number of separate mesh objects. So we've got 3 sets of hearts and the bikes, so that's 4 meshes. So when come time to create our actions, we end up with a lot of actions. But the import-export process does a lot of over-duplication because I'm not quite sure why it does this per se, but what it's doing is assigning each of the animated sequences in Blender, or it's associating each of the sequences. So these are the morph animations, and these are the node or bone equivalent animations. So these are your XAFs versus XPF. And the way that I don't know if it's Blender export or IMVU import, but somewhere in that process the morph, this sequence and these channels, these are the channels, and this sequence, this is associated with that balloon or smoke item. And it has a set of shape keys or morph targets. That's these. So that's the morphs. That allows us to create the sequence, and we just change the value that's attributed to the morph at different keyframes. I'll just run over that in a bit. And that controls this heart. But during export, it gets associated with this, this, and this. So for some reason, there's an association or a link made between all of these objects and this morph sequence. So this morph sequence gets duplicated 4 times, or 3 times. So it's 3 additional. And it starts to get very complicated in terms of trying to figure out which sequence is supposed to be for what object. And the end result on export or export-import is that we get all of this. And there should really only be 3, 4. So that's Heart 1, Heart 2, Heart 3, and the bike. So there should only really be 4 listed here. But the way all the FBX stuff works, it's not jumbling everything together, but it does this over duplication, so it starts to become complicated in terms of figuring out what's going on. But all of this is because of using nodes. because each of these is still treated as a separate object, as well as the meshes all being separate objects. So for complicated objects, or complicated furniture items, rooms, or accessories that require morph animation, so the morph sequence in this instance is as the heart comes out of the pipe, the exhaust, it's tiny whilst it's inside, so it's hidden. It's essentially hidden from view. And then as it emerges, the morph, we change the values of the morph and make it smaller or larger. So that's disappeared. And that, for morph targets, automatically inserts the value at the keyframe. So that node will update and adjust itself based on the value that's assigned. And because these two are the same, the carryover, or the indicator that indicates similarity or sameness or duplication, disappears. But yes, with nodes, morphs gets complicated. So what we have to do, 27. What you have to do is use skeletons or armatures. So you have to use an armature object in order to get the morph to work. And that basically means that you are joining all the meshes together into a single object and then assigning all your morphs. So we've got all the morphs that are attributed to the hearts and the bike itself. So that's the pipe. So we've got the pipe animation, which is it just opening and closing essentially. Well, it's not. Polly's saying in chat, reasons not to use FBX. See, I don't know if it's the FBX format itself, or it's just something that's going on, importing the FBX data into IMVU, because this version, or this using skeletons, it works perfectly fine. So I suspect it's just something to do with the way that the nodes are organized hierarchically inside the FBX, and that's causing issues when that is imported into IMVU. I suspect that that's what's going on, because when you use an actual skeleton, which is a defined structure in of its own right, so if you looked at the FBX file, there would be two objects. So that would be the mesh and the skeleton, or the armature. But within the skeleton would contain its own sub-hierarchy, and that would be the individual bones. And I suspect that the issue is that using nodes, all the objects are treated as objects. So there are no sub-hierarchies. Even if everything's linked up, there's no, what would you say, object-based sub-hierarchy, in the same way that we've got a mesh object and a skeleton object. And within that there is sub-objects, which are the bones. And then within the mesh, you could say that there are sub-elements of the mesh based on, I mean, this is using a sort of a pseudo 3D Studio Max analogy, that you could use your materials essentially as descriptors for sub-elements within the mesh. But for complex animations, so we've got What were we talking about? Oh yes, that's right. So we've got a bunch of shape keys, but they're all part of the same sequence. So we've got a morph animation, which is the hearts and the bike, and then we've got the skeletal animation, which is the bike just slowly bobbing up and down. So on export, this generally means that there are only going to be two sequences. Now did we do one? Yes, so, and that's essentially the difference. So this, what we're looking at now, is the skeletal version, which is an armature, versus where everything's separate. If everything's separate and using nodes, you get this massive overduplication of sequences. Whereas if everything is all tied together and controlled using a skeleton, an actual armature object or skeletal object, it's very limited in terms of it only exports the sequences that are visible in the file and assigned to objects specifically. So essentially just two tracks, two animation tracks. So in terms of morph animations or animations in general, for furniture, rooms, accessories, and maybe other non-avatar skeletal items, if you need complex animations, because this is quite a complicated sequence to set up, you're best off, in Blender at least, using an armature as opposed to nodes. So if you want simple furniture, use nodes. If you want complicated furniture or rooms, it looks like we're going to use skeletons. But caveat to that is that we can, because there is a, let me find the file. Oh no, it was Robot Turkey. That's what there it is. That's what Robot Turkey. Yes, Liana. I mean, these aren't. I mean, obviously with these streams, we're not just. It's not just click this, do that, and voila, you've got a product. This is the more sort of is it esoteric or esoteric? This is the stuff that you don't find in tutorials because people just generally aren't interested in knowing why they do things or whatever. This is the stuff that, if you really want to improve your skills, this is the stuff that you need to know and you need to learn. But most tutorials are just about button pressing. Just move this here and do that. So well, we do have, I mean, the advantage of the FBX stuff is, I'm trying to find the file now. So, this is an example of a it's not a compromise as such, but I suppose you could use that word. So what we've got is an animated character that is controlled by a skeleton. Where's the it's controlled by a skeleton, but the skeleton doesn't control the product as a furniture item. A node does. So we can parent or we can link skeletons to nodes. And although I've not tried this, we can use nodes. We can link nodes to skeletons, but they're only linkable as objects rather than. So if Polly was, I asked Polly about this, and she was saying something along the lines of, in Max, if you add a node, which for us is an empty, so I'll just use a cube, and that's going to be tiny, so I have to resize that, make it huge so that we can see it. In Max, if you add a node and then link that to a skeleton, or yes, it's linking. So if you add a node on the expectation that this is going to behave like a bone and control a particular element of the mesh, we can't do that in Blender because our nodes only control objects. They don't control sub-elements or aspects of a mesh via vertex groups. Only a skeleton or an armature for us can do that. But we can use them in combination with the skeleton to control various things, depending, like, for example, this node could control these nuts and bolts. Yes. Yeah, so, I mean, we can use nodes to control miscellaneous things, like these nuts and bolts. But we can't use a node to control the mesh in the same way that an armature does, because they are functionally different objects, or different types of data, I should say. But what all of this is leading to is that we can use different combinations of things that at the end of the day will create a hierarchy. And that's all we need. So this is our root object. So everything is, so the skeleton is linked to that, and then this node would be linked to the skeleton, and together they're all linking through and creating a chain or a hierarchy that's usable or understandable in IMVU. Yeah, so if you look at your chair object, yeah, so if you look at your throne object, then yes, that's going to be a similar issue too. So if I just load up the so your throne object, your thrones with your throne with the flute, is going to be a skeletal animation thing. So if you imagine that these hearts, well, if they were separate objects, but if you imagine that the hearts were your flute, their position is being controlled by the bones, not by the position of the mesh, so to speak. So if you are using nodes, that's going to create a similar problem to this, in the sense that you have separate meshes, and then you're trying to synchronize everything together so that it all works. And it can be tricky if you're talking about well, actually, it's this type of movement. If your movement is relative to an axis, or an axis, so let's say this bone was connected to this bone. So these two bones were connected, so that's the two. If your animation was just literally a rotational animation, so you're just changing the rotational position of the bone, then your animation or the sequence that's produced is going to be relatively straightforward. But if you're talking about translating the position of a bone, so you're moving the bone in 3D space all over the place, you are better off using an armature as your controlling mechanism instead of nodes. And that may be why it was difficult to get the flute to animate properly, because the nodes are always treated as completely independent objects. Even though they may be linked to create a hierarchy, they're always treated as separate objects. So come time to export and import, what IMVU is seeing is a group of separate objects instead of a single object with sub-objects. So there's a functional difference between an armature as an object and the armature as it contains sub-objects, which are the bones. So each of these bones is a sub-object of an object, which is the armature. So that may be something that you take a look at. Just swap out. You can keep the root node. Whoops. You can keep the root node. So what you would then need to do is parent your throne skeleton to the root node as an object. So you're doing the usual right click, shift right click, and then doing Control P, parent and keep object. And that way you can you create the hierarchy that's necessary for the skeleton, and that'll work as per the robot turkey, because that's all that is. So the skeleton is parented to the root node. The mesh also is parented to the skeleton, so that the skeleton controls the turkey. So that may be something that you want to look at. But for the harder bike, so for the harder bike, Liana's saying in chat, so like, let's say for example, if one made a cabinet and wanted the door to open, the door would be a bone or a plane. or plate. So if you were taking a plate, yeah. So if the examples, so Liana is giving an example of kitchen cabinet with a plate inside that you want to take out and put on a table. You could do that with nodes, but it may be easier to do that with an armature. So you would have a set of bones. You would have, however you've got your furniture set up, and then the plate and the door are controlled by separate bones. So you would have two bones. One would be called door and one would be called plate. Door would rotate around the hinge of the door of the mesh, and plate would just be a bone that you translate or place it from the shelf onto the desk or the kitchen top. So those types of animation where you're doing more complex things than just rotating around an axis are generally going to be best off using armatures and skeletons. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to use only a skeleton or an armature. I might have to do something, a tutorial or a short video on something about this to make it a bit clearer with pictures, an illustrated tutorial. So with the Harder bike, so what we did was we got rid of which is still in this project file, but the nodes have been removed in favour of a skeleton, and the meshes have all been joined together into a single mesh. So we've got one mesh and one skeletal object, which is an armature. So that means that all those condense them down, so we only really needed one, and that was just to shrink the hearts down. But this does get a bit tricky to manage. So what you can do is, if you've got this all set up so that if your item has multiple things in it and it's doing multiple things, each element of your mesh is going to be controlled by a specific bone. So that means we've got vertex groups. So when you put the mesh together, everything is basically shoved back in a box, basically, so that they all occupy the same position. And that makes it very difficult to manage. So how do you select? So there are 3 hearts occupying the same space here. So how do you select? We don't want this one on the top. We want maybe the one at the bottom. So each of the hearts is using the same material. So ordinarily, you could use materials as a way to control your selections. So you'd select in material properties, select your material that you wanted to select on the mesh, and then just select, and it selects the component. You can only do that if that material is associated with that section of the mesh. If you've got multiple elements of the mesh using the same material, we have to do it a different way, and we can use the vertex groups. So we can select certain elements of the mesh based on using the vertex groups. So you select the group, so that's in object data properties, select, and if I just go into wireframe, oh, they're teeny tiny, so whoops. Oh, that is the one thing that we have to watch out for. So can I there we go. Ordinarily, the shape keys are not visible in edit mode. So you can disable, enable their visibility in edit mode. That's alright, Polly. Thanks for stopping by, and good luck with the printer. So we can use vertex groups as a method of selection. And then once you've got all of that, or your morph set up, your morph targets, then you can start the animation process. Yes, Liana. That's the you'll want to make the flute. So the chair itself will have a node as the root, and then you can have a skeleton, an armature, parented to the root node, and then a bone within the armature controlling the position of the flute. Yeah. Yeah, it's pros and cons, basically. So for simple furniture, simple animations, so for just bobbing up and down, a node-based furniture item is perfectly fine. But as we're explaining, or as we're going through this, we can see that there are better advantages with using an armature, because it means the end result is much more readily controllable, because you can better control the position of each of the bones and all the elements relative to a skeleton that's fixed, as opposed to the nodes, which are all independent objects. So what we've got is a single mesh with a number of morph channels associated with it. So we've got two morphs. That's bike 1 and bike 2. Two morphs associated with the way the pipes work. And then we've got 3 morphs, 1 for each heart, just to change the size of the heart as it's brought out of the pipe. And we can then use the position of the bones to better position the heart as it relates to the exhaust. So so that's a little bit up there at the moment, so we can probably just bring that down a little bit. Just double check that this is the latest version. Yeah, so reload that. Right, so what we want to do Yes, that frustration will happen. Ha. So that's the bone that controls this heart that we're looking at. That's the keyframe. So we can just drop this down a little. Insert the keyframe. Location rotation. Don't need scale because the scale is being done by the morph. There we go. So there's a little adjustment for that one. Yeah. There we go. Just make some minor adjustments there. So if we play this through, this will be quite slow because we're streaming at the same time, but and it's set to loop. So the start frame is 40 and the end frame is 85. So that's basically... So where's frame 40? There's 40. So it's this block that's being looped. And for this, even though it is a looped animation, it cycles, we don't necessarily need the first and last frames to be exactly the same as you would normally, because the loop or the cycle is the appearance of a heart being pushed out of the exhaust. So let's export this. So save 27, then export. So to export, right click, shift right click. So we're selecting the armature last. FBX, selected, disable these add modifiers, armatures, disable add leaf bones, animation, disable NLA strips, and force start and end keying. 27. Okay, export. So now we import this into IMVU. So create a new derivable. Rooms of furniture, furniture. Go. So that's the default, which is the chair. And then we're going to import. So FBX import, load FBX. And we want 27. If the FBX import process works correctly, it should just load the FBX into the importer converter, and you won't get the skeletal selection pop-up. So change the scale 0.01, deselect, rename, mesh, that's 0 because we want it to replace the stool, or the chair. So it's brought in action bike and action bike, our node, not nodes, morph animations. Import. Okay. Import. Apply changes. So there is the imported mesh data. So assign the vertex painting. And we've only got one mesh. It's got 4 textures, obviously, but one mesh. And then we can add, let's do stance.idle for now. This is room. So add a reference point. So this one will just bounce the bike up and down. And move the objects. So the end and start and end of that is 40 and 85. That looks okay. It looks like there is one sequence where it looks like you can see the heart dropping back into the bike, but that's okay. And then add the morph, which I'm not quite sure which one it is. Smoke 1, 2, 3. Let's try the top one first. So 0, that loops infinitely. And there we go. Oh, it's doing the... So I need to set that 40 and 85 as well. So there we have exhaust pipe. Does seem to be quite tracking now, so let's check the other animation. And we can slow this down a little, so 0.75, 0.75. that's 40, 85, 40 and 85. It's still not perfect, just, I guess, because of the limitations of the way that IMVU works. Because for some reason we've got the hearts changing size halfway up the... which they shouldn't be doing. And doing the opposite at the exhaust pipes. Yeah, it's I'm not quite sure what's going on there. Let's check that in Blender. So 40 and 85. So that's what it should be doing. Obviously the playback of this is very slow because we're streaming at the same time. But there's no hiccups there. It's doing what it needs to do. But it's not doing that in IMVU. So what we've got happening is it's oscillating or switching between the hearts just appearing at the exhaust pipe but not being shrunk down to a tiny size and then being thrown out the back. But that sequence seems to be happening along the length of so approximately about here the hearts seem to be appearing and from shrink, and they're moving, the sequence is moving upwards. So there's a not a synchronization issue. Well, it is a synchronization issue, but I'm not quite sure why it's doing that. Because now the disappearing is closer to the end of... So it starts as a tiny thing. It should be thrown out of the pipes and be full size. But this unit of animation is occurring at different points along the entire duration, which is a bit weird. Yeah, so I'm not quite sure what's going on there. There's got to be a timing or a synchronization issue. Because it shouldn't do that at all. But what we can do, though, was so stance dot heart o bike hyphen seat 01. Oh, so that's what you'd want. Right, so aha, right, so let's say for the sake of argument the animation is sorted out. So the next phase So we want stance.idle so when the bike is not being used, we should see that. So what we've done there is used the first frame of the animation as a static pose. So we've created a static pose, so nothing happens when the bike is not being used. So when it's idle, nothing happens. So what we can do is add a stance.heartObike, which is the seat node name, reference the seat number, so IMVU knows which specific seat node. This is avatar. Play the same, and we want both of them to be active. Set the frame range, so that's 40. Let's try 84. Whoops, 84. 40 to 84. Infinite loop. And replace. Change the speed. So it's still doing nothing, but as soon as we use the... Oh. Oh, I did that yesterday. That's very weird. Ow. So what should happen is that should trigger the animation. So let me just double check. Yeah, so I'm just checking the names. So we've got the capture and picture bones, which are these two, and those are picture 01.sitting and catcher 01.sitting. We've got bike, which is the upright one, and then linked to that we have seat 01 dot heartobike. And handle 01 is linked to bike as well, so when bike moves, all the nodes move that are linked to the bike itself. So where's, right, so that's hard to bike. Yep, that's fine. That's very odd, because that should... I wonder if... So this is where it gets a little tricky, and I don't know if this is FBX that's doing this, because obviously the FBX is working, because it gave us the heart and the animation that we were just looking at, but for some reason stance, I think it's stance dot heart of bike hyphen Ceto1. So that tells IMVU which seat is supposed to be using. So that when that seat is used, when the avatar sits in it, it activates the animation. But for some reason it's not doing that, so let's just try save the file. Close all these editors and create mode, and then reopen. Open the file we were just looking at, 16. Which is still set up to with our two sequences. Yeah, it's not working. That's odd. Okay, so let's try something else then. So how do we do this? So we don't need... So the core elements that we need... Yeah, more weird stuff, Liana. Yes, very true. So what we're going to do... Let's try something else. So save this file, save as 28. So what we're going to do is delete the seat node bones and the root bone. And then what we're going to do so now the interesting thing is that the origin, which is this point on screen that we can see, that the widget is at, this circle, that origin is what Blender is using for its coordinates, or its the coordinates for the positions of the bones relate to this spot, this origin point of the object. That's why when you remove the root bone, it doesn't do anything to the skeleton, doesn't do anything to the overall skeleton. But what we can do here then, now that we've got rid of root, we can delete that. We can delete picture, we can delete catcher, and we can delete seat 01 heart bike and handle. So all those channels that we had before, we don't need them anymore. but the bike will still animate. So now what we can do is go back to our nodes that we had before, and we want, just hide the dummy for now. Just double check the setup. Okay, let's unparent everything. So Alt P and then clear parent and keep transform. So what that does is it clears all the links between all the objects, but it'll keep the objects, it'll lock the objects' positions in space, so it won't move them around. So Alt P, keep transform. So now the root node doesn't control anything. Right, so what we want is to get rid of the HeartBike node, because we no longer need that, because that is being replaced by a skeleton. So we'll just move that out of the way. So what we want are the seat node and the handle node, and those will be parented to the armature object. So control, so that shift right click and then shift right click the skeleton, control P, and we want them object keep transform. So that'll keep their location, but that means that the it's not doing it. Why is it not doing it? Let's do that again. So do object instead then. Object. Still not doing it. That's weird. Parent. Oh, of course. Right, I see what's happening. So I have to think about this. Because what we're doing is, so when we parent keep transform, so it's parenting itself to the armature relative to the position of the origin point of the armature, not the bones. So when the animation, when that bobs up and down, these two objects stay put because they're linked to the origin, or they're using the origin as their local position as opposed to the bones position within the armature. So that means, I wonder if you can I don't think you can do this. Bone. So let's try that. Bike. Yeah, so that's what we want. Whoops. So that should mean, yes, now it works. So that's what we wanted. It was to parent to the bone itself. So that's shift right click, armature last, control P. We want bone. So we then double check this, select the node, and in object properties we'll get the options to set the type of parenting. So we can parent to the armature, the object, but in this instance we just want the bone. So when the animation occurs, those two nodes follow. and then the armature is parented to root. And that can be object, because that's just a simple reference. So if we unhide the double check so the mesh now needs to be parented oh, it still is, that's okay. Capture and picture, that's the root. So let's try this version. So this is 28, so save as. See if this works. So what we've basically done is used a combination of nodes for some elements of the furniture item, but a skeleton for the others. The skeleton gives us much more control over the mesh, and this is similar to the robot turkey. The only difference between this and the robot turkey is that this one has seat nodes. So it'll be interesting to see if the seat nodes come through in the eventual export. So we'll do that now. So save, export. So a lot of this is trial and error for these complex items, particularly if we're using Blender. Don't have these issues as much with 3D Studio Max. So selected objects, apply modifiers, disable that for the morphs, otherwise it'll destroy them. Armatures, add leaf bones, make sure that's disabled. Animation, NLA strips and end starts, that's disabled. So export. So let's see what that does. Create, new derivable, furniture, go. FBX import, load FBX, this is 28. Right, so now this gives us the option, and this is the difference between the way that an armature hierarchical skeleton is seen by the FBX, because the FBX is seeing each element of the FBX file as a separate bone, if you like, of the overall skeleton. So it will list 10 bones and 1 mesh, where what we actually want is just 6 bones. Yeah, 6 bones. So let's try that one first. See if this works. Alright, so apply scale 0.01. Disable that. Mesh 0. Got our materials, we've got our morph animations, and etc. Import. Apply changes. Uh-oh. Oh, that'll be because that'll be a rotation thing. So what's the rotation of the skeleton? This is one of the so let's just double check. Right, so because we removed the root node that was anchoring the skeleton, let's just try and set up the animation and see if that actually works. $40.85 replace, and then the looped morph. Playback speed. And just do stance idle, just to get this playing. Stance idle. Room. Rocket ship to Mars. So let's switch that to Harterbike. Seat 01. Oh, there we go, that's working. That. Ew, that's playing backwards. So this is the one that we were just adjusting. This is what we just fiddled around with. So the sequence is now playing backwards. So what it was, the action needed to be set to room or furniture, and not avatar. So it's still idle, it's showing us nothing. And then when the avatar uses it, the animation plays, but it's not replacing the so that's very odd. So it's not without its issues doing these more complicated products. So let's do a stance.idle for this one. Room. Same ensemble, and we want infinite loops, and that is frames 1 and 2. Right, so yeah, see, there's a problem with the FBX. It's inverting the that is so weird. Because what it should do is just I think, do I have a version of that? 13, I think. Alright, so this is partially what should happen. So when the avatar is sat on there, the animation activates, but these should be shrunk down and invisible. But for some reason, even with the adjustments that we've made, what it's doing is inverting the sequence. Oh, that's the wrong one. So it's inverting the... I'm not entirely sure why it's doing that. Let's just put the reference object in. So the animation is playing, or at least a skeletal animation, and the morph is playing, but the morph is inverted for some reason. Which is, so that stance idle is nothing happening. And then stance.heartabike-ceto1, which is a seat node, when that's used, it activates the animations. For some reason, it's playing the morph backwards. So if you were wanting to do a complicated object, it's debatable whether you would, this might be an issue with the FBX importer or the FBX file or something. It's debatable whether you set this up, or these types of items up, so that they're just playing, they're just active all the time. So rather than necessarily having... See, because that works. But with that, this is the older version, you can't fiddle around with the morph animations because it does all of this. So it's not even the lesser of two evils, it's just all completely evil for the full stop. Everything's evil. Yeah, so to fix that, that would mean because the root node was lying on its back, so it'd have to unparent that, keep transform. Unparent the mesh. Okie dokie, get rid of the, whoops. Right, so what you'd have to do to try and fix that is, basically have to get rid of, just unparent everything, do this again, so lie this on its back, apply rotation scale, rotate it back up, and then set everything up again. So we now have to parent these to bones. Whoops. Bike. And what that should do is compensate for the root bone that we had. So link all these together. So double check everything is right. So that is right. Okay, so let's try that. (28B). So let's export that and see what that does. Same settings, selected, disabled, 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 disabled. New furniture item. Import FBX. Let's try 10 bones next. Import the same file but just use 10 bones. Disable 0. That's okay. Import. Okay. That's weird. So let's try that with 10 bones. Right, so 10 bones. What's hiding? Well, there's nothing hiding. Okay, 10 bones. Take a look at skeleton. Okay, 0.01, disable. 0. Got a couple more action sequences coming through there. Let's see what this does. Oh, there we go. That's weird. So let's see. So this is the same file. So this is this combination file where we've got nodes and armature. Actions. So let's just get this stance.idle room. So we want bike.action place from frame 40 to 85. Loop that. Okay, so that works. Bike action, loop that. Again, frame 40, 85. Right, so that works. So let's now start heart o bike hyphen seat 01. So that all stays the same. So that should play when the seat node is used, which it does. Now we need to add the stance pose, stance.idle room, same as, and we want whoops, so we want frames 1 and 2 for that, frames 1 and 2 for that. Replace. Okay. So that works. So when we click on the, yeah, it messes up the FBX, the animation. So there's something weird going on with the morphs when they are essentially not overriding. I guess it's not overriding the so stance.heartbyte, the seat node trigger, is not overriding, or it's not correctly overriding the stance.idle. So when the thing is not being used, the idle animation is it's doing what it needs to do, which is not showing anything. Nothing's happening. But that trigger that triggers the animation is somehow breaking the morph animation. So I wonder if so there is a pose for that. So let's see if we can add that pose back in, because it didn't work before. Pose 6. We want 86 bones for this. Don't need those, don't need those, just need the pose. 0.01 import. Okay. Apply changes. We have to reset the armature that's used. And then we need to set up an animation, not an animation, an action for the seat node. So that will be stance.heart bike seat 01. And this is for the avatar, so this is the avatar. And we should have pelvis. That's our avatar pose. Replace. Loops infinite. One to two. It's not working. That is weird. Because that pose is that pose. So I guess, what's the moral of this? Well, it looks like the FBX import-export process isn't quite working the way it should. But if you were going to export using Cal3D from Blender, you have to use a skeleton. So this entire furniture item would need to be a skeleton. Because the Cal3D doesn't understand what nodes are. So you have to think about your items in terms of what it is that you want them to do. Because some things will work without a hitch. So if this was just a simple furniture item with no particularly... This isn't necessarily a complex animation, but an animation, in fact, where is it? Right, this is for the. It's one of the files that accompanies the education tutorial files. I think I wrote. Oh, there we go. So this is a simple animation where the objects just rotate using a control, which is just called roundabout, but that's linked to the root node, and the root node controls everything. But this works fine as a furniture item because it's just a simple rotational animation. So the node just rotates around, and the seat nodes for the avatar are linked to that, and it works without a hitch. Simple animation. So simple furniture item, simple animation. Where the difficulty starts to come into play in terms of making sure that things export the way that they should export and they behave the way that you're expecting them to behave. When you start doing complicated things like this, the behavior doesn't work. It's not guaranteed using. This is one of the downsides of using Blender, is that Blender's great, etc., but it's not 100% compatible with IMVU. I don't know what the current state of development is with the FBX stuff, but compared to 3D Studio Max, compatibility is I'd say maybe 70% there, but that remaining 30% is associated with much of this. Much of this is associated with these more complex products that have animation. And as we saw earlier, the animation plays perfectly fine in terms of how it's supposed to appear in Blender, but that doesn't appear the way that it should in IMVU. And yes, it's a synchronization problem, because as time goes on, the morph animation moves up the path of the sequence. So that tells me that there is a. So it's starting here now, and it'll gradually move slowly up the path of the animation. So that tells me that there's an issue with the way the FBX data is being interpreted. So I don't know what the answer to that is. It just basically means, I suppose, planning ahead in terms of the complexity of the objects that you're trying to create for IMVU that involve animation. So if they involve anything other than just rotating around a spot, so something like this is perfectly fine. This export's fine. But this is potentially going to cause you problems, because there's a lot going on here. So it looks like that means that the harder bike is basically going to be either on all the time, or just have to accept that those hearts are going to be visible all the time. So if we create a stance.idle for this, because there's no, there isn't a way to necessarily. Let's see what this does. 0, 2. Right, so that works. So what will happen when? Yeah, see, it's Yeah, that's something to do with the way that the FBX data is not being interpreted correctly. But where that happens, whether that's Blender to FBX or FBX to IMVU, and then IMVU actually to Cal 3D, because what the IMVU importer is actually doing is converting the FBX data into a whole load of Cal 3D files. So I guess the moral of the story is be very careful how you want your objects to animate, or what type of animation you want to bring into your projects. So, of course, the disadvantage of joining everything together is that you can't have the speed at which the bike goes up and down is essentially the thing that determines the length or the duration of the animation. So if you want a slow up and a slow down, that could be 120 frames. But because everything is joined together, that basically means that 120 frames has to be animated for every object that sits within that range of frames. So that means the morph animation has to be 120 frames. The movement of these smoke hearts has to be 120 frames. And it has to cycle, it has to repeat itself. So that's the one downside to using a single mesh and a single armature. Whereas with multiple objects, you can animate each of the objects independently of one another. So you can have the bike animation can be 120 frames going up and down, but the hearts only need maybe 60. And that 60 will loop whilst the 120 is still playing out. That's one of the advantages of splitting files into projects into sections. But the disadvantage is that you then get all these synchronization problems. So, you know, no worries, Liana. I'm just saying that there are advantages and disadvantages to using single meshes, single armatures versus separate meshes and separate nodes, because you can import multiple animation sequences, whereas with everything being joined together you can only do one, and everything has to be controlled at the same time through that same sequence. So the moral of the story for animated items, or complex animations with items, is to plan ahead and do some testing to see whether you can do what you're actually trying to do. And so with the Harter bike, we've kind of got it to work the way we expect it to. Unfortunately, because we can't rescale bones, because that would be an alternative, is that you would scale the size of a bone. And that would scale down the mesh. But IMVU can't use scaling for bones. So that's what the morphs are for. So we're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place, as they say. Oh wow, we're coming up on 2 hours. So I guess we'll call it quits there. Because there's little else that we can actually do to... Well, it's not even fix this. We can't really fix this because there's something going on with the data that's being imported into IMVU. Because what should happen is that in the idle spot, these should be tiny, as they are here. And then as soon as the pose is activated, it should then cancel out that stance.idle and just animate as expected, but it doesn't do that. So I'm not sure what to. Might have to send some emails to the technical team at IMVU and see if they've got a solution to this. But otherwise, it doesn't affect simpler furniture items or rooms or accessories that have simpler animations. Well, on that note, as we're coming up to 2 hours, do the usual thing of subscribe, click the follow button, linky, clicky, clicky, so you're notified when the next stream goes live. Yeah, it looks pretty good, but it's not exactly behaving the way that it should. So, I mean, are people going to be really that bothered by the fact that the hearts are visible when the bike is not being used? I mean, that's the question you've got to ask yourself. Do people care enough about an item being like that? I don't know.